All right, so here is the plan. I'm going to start with about 20 minutes of background. Part of that's going to be time for questions too, so it won't be too long. And then we're going to dive into some map review. So we'll look at some of the draft blueprint priorities and poke around. You can identify what's looking good, what needs some work. And then we're going to have a poll on wording and data access. And then finally, we'll finish off with some kind of next steps where we go from here and get a little feedback on this workshop itself. So that's the plan. So let's start with a little background on the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or CCAS. Covers a pretty big area of the Southeast, now including all of the federal U.S. waters in the Atlantic and the Gulf, 15 states, 2 territories. About as big of a definition as you could possibly imagine for the Southeast U.S. And it started with the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, who brought in a number of the federal agencies from the Southeast Natural Resource Leaders Group, who then later brought in a number of nonprofits as well. And it started back when landscape conservation cooperatives were gaining traction as these kind of independent, self-directed partnerships across the Southeast. A number of the different ones, the Caribbean, the Gulf Coast Prairies, Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks, Peninsula Florida. And basically it was designed to figure out, okay, we've got all this great work going on, these partnerships. How do we make it all add up? How do we connect that stuff across a bigger area? So strengthen that collaboration and make sure this stuff all adds up. And doing it in a way that honored all the agencies' different responsibilities and authorities and things like that. So what does CCAS do? It does 3 big things. It sets a bold vision and an ambitious goal. It designs a blueprint for action, which is most of what we're going to be talking about today. And then also clears barriers to cross-state collaboration. So here's the vision for CCAS, a connected network of lands and waters that supports thriving fish and wildlife populations and improved quality of life for people. We have a number of other sort of metrics and tracking things that go towards this vision and a goal, but we're going to be focusing mostly on the blueprint itself today. So I wanted to start with the bigger vision of that connected network of lands and waters. And the conservation blueprint is basically a living spatial plan that identifies important places for that connected network of lands and waters. So where are those important places? And it's living because it's regularly updated and improved based on the best information we have. And it's helping a lot of people from a bunch of different organizations bring in new funding and inform their conservation decisions. It's set up to help bring in new conservation funding to the South and help us all use our current resources more efficiently. And that's happening at multiple scales, from federal agencies prioritizing work across the whole Southeast, all the way down to small land trusts and municipalities prioritizing parcel level information. So it's a big mix of different scales and all kinds of different folks. This is the latest version, the 2022 version of the Southeast Conservation Blueprint that came out in last October. And so this showing those prioritizations across the whole area. That darkest purple area is the highest priority for a connected network of lands and waters. So that's the top 10% of the priorities themselves. And so then as you go down the colors, you have high priority, medium priority areas, all the way down to priority connections, which are some additional connectivity that we add in. And when you add all this stuff up, you end up with 50% of the Southeast covered by some level of priority. Some things to keep in mind. It is definitely not perfect and it's never done. So we're always looking for ways to improve the blueprint itself. And we've been updating it every year for a number of years now. And so the blueprint itself is providing this regional perspective. And so the intent is for it to be used in combination with y'all's local data and knowledge, the information you already have. So it brings in that big picture, but it's supposed to complement the local information, the local knowledge y'all already have. The 2022 version is based on cultural and natural resource indicators, 37 of them total, and that represents terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems. So today we're going to be talking a lot about the ocean, especially the deep ocean waters as we get offshore. The 2022 version, it doesn't include the Virgin Islands at all. and it uses an older and different data source to inform Puerto Rico. So we're regularly revising the blueprint, though, based on the best available data we can find, and then input, feedback from the conservation community, information about changing on the ground conditions, those kind of things. And so these workshops are part of that process where we're always looking for figuring out what needs to be improved and how do we fix it. So here's some history on the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. So as I mentioned before, CCAS is about stitching together those different efforts. And the beginning, the blueprint started with a number of these landscape conservation cooperatives, which each kind of did their own planning and prioritization efforts. Different methods, different approaches. They work together to try to align things as well as possible. But in general, there were a lot of differences across them. And so the blueprint started off as a way to, okay, how do we add all those pieces up and get them as close to each other as possible in a more consistent data set? So that's what the blueprint started off doing, pulling all those pieces together from different plans. As of 2021, this was the coverage of the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, and these are all the different inputs, all the different spatial plans that came into this. So a lot of different ones, the cross-hatched areas or overlap zones between multiple inputs. And so we were still doing our best to glue all the different pieces together. But over time, over the last few years, especially, the top priorities from folks on improving the blueprint, the feedback we kept hearing is we want more consistency, we want more consistent methods and metrics and all these other things. Because folks really kept wanting to use the blueprint across the entire Gulf of Mexico, across big multi-state areas, across, so they would start cutting across different inputs and places and things like that. So a lot of the feedback we got from folks is we want more consistency in this bigger Southeast blueprint. So then 2022, we did the first major step towards that, which was basically covering all of 15 states and part of the Atlantic Ocean with consistent methods and approaches. That's that green area, the base blueprint. So all of that, consistent methods and approaches. And so built off a lot of the lessons learned from those individual plans and then figured out, okay, how do we then do something consistent across the whole area? So that's 2022, but we were still adding in a few things. We were adding in stuff from the Florida Marine Blueprint. We were adding in some work from a long time ago in Puerto Rico, prioritizing watersheds. And then this year, we're basically finishing off the entire CCAS area in consistent metrics and indicators and methods and things like that. So this year, 2023, that full green area is getting covered. Now, here are the overall methods for the blueprint. So step one, we start with a bunch of different ecosystem indicators. What are those important things that we want to capture in that connected network of lands and waters? Then we use the indicators to rank areas. That's where we get the priorities for a connected network. Then we add additional connectivity by adding corridors that link hubs. And finally, we put them all together in the priority areas and the corridors into the conservation blueprint. Now, for the purposes of this area and the marine side, we do not have the corridors yet. We're still working on some inland connections. And so the marine corridors depend on some inland updates on the blueprint itself. So what we're going to be reviewing is the priorities themselves and not the additional corridors just yet for this particular workshop. All right, so let's talk about indicators. Well, basically, when we're talking about indicators, it's something that's designed to inform us easily and quickly about the conditions of the system. In this case, they're very spatial. We want to quickly and easily know where are those important places for a connected network of lands and waters. So that maybe it doesn't cover every single species or things like that, but they're indicators. And so we test them to make sure they're indicating things other than themselves. But to the best degree, with all these different metrics, we look and see how well the indicators we're using are covering other things based on survey data, other models, and other pieces as well. And the other thing is we work from existing data and efforts as much as possible. So we're really trying to build off of the great work that's already going on here and glue them together and integrate them. So we do sometimes create new stuff, but most of the time it's when there's no other choice and there's just a huge gap. But most of the time we're trying to work with existing efforts and trying to integrate those. So here are the offshore marine indicators, just a quick list of them. So you'll see in the chat now a link to a little cheat sheet that has the list of all these different indicators. And so this just gives you a very high level, quick, what is the indicator and where do the data come from? So what are the data sources for each? So you got a little sheet that's in the chat right now to take a look at. We have full documentation for all these things too, all the different why it was selected and all the mapping steps and code and all those different pieces as well. So these will be all these are all still draft indicators because we may make some updates and improvements just based on feedback from the workshops themselves. And also all the data, information, code, all that fun stuff. Once the blueprint gets released in October, then we release all of that stuff as well. So it's publicly available for folks to use as well. All right, here's a visual of just what some of these look like. So I'm just going to go through them so you can kind of see some of the patterns. This is Atlantic hard bottom habitat. So we're looking at probability of hard bottom here. Darker colors are higher values. That's across all of these different ones. So this is Atlantic hard bottom habitat. This is what Atlantic deep sea coral looks like. So this is looking at that kind of predicted genus richness across the whole area here in the Atlantic side. We also have Atlantic marine birds. So these marine birds, this is integrating not just species, but also the sort of seasonality of the species. So it's pulling in important areas for marine birds across not just all the different birds, but also across all the different months of the year. This is Atlantic marine birds. And then we also have Atlantic marine mammals, so kind of the mammalian equivalent of that. And this is what that looks like. Now on the Gulf side, we've got Gulf hard bottom habitat, Gulf deep sea coral. This is again predicted genus richness, like we had in the Atlantic. Gulf marine mammals, in this case, those bluer colors are the higher values as you go down, but similar idea as the Atlantic. We're trying to have paired things across the Gulf and Atlantic as much as possible, even though the data sources are a little bit different every time. And this is Gulf sea turtles indicator as well. So this is doing some similar things across different months and for different sea turtles as well. That's just looking at kind of important areas for sea turtle species out in the deep ocean. All right, so that's just a quick visual of what some of these patterns look like in the indicators. Now, how do we go from these different indicators to the priorities themselves? Well, it's not just a stacking exercise. So we're not just taking all those layers and summing them up. It's essentially a portfolio of places that support all the indicators. And so it's looking at, okay, how do we get these important things for all these different species, for all these different indicators in a bigger portfolio? And we use a conservation planning tool called Zonation to do that. And in practice, there are two types of places that end up as high priority. So places with high values for multiple indicators. So these are things you'd expect no matter what. These are just hot spots across all kinds of different metrics. But we also pull out as high priority places with high values for a single indicator that just can't be found anywhere else. And so that's kind of another key component here. So you get some really high values off the coast of Texas for important places for Kemp's Ridleys during certain times of the year. Well, even if that doesn't overlap with your hard bottom or some of your other components, that could still be a high priority if it's just not easily found somewhere else. So that's the other thing that comes out here. Now, there are a few different ways of explaining kind of how the prioritization works. I like to do it visually just with pictures because it's more fun and I like pictures. So I'm going to give you a quick visual of how this works in practice with some of the indicators, but we're also going to drop in the chat a little sheet that has more details on the methods of how zonation works and links to more details and papers and stuff like that. So if you want to go into the guts of the mechanics of how zonation does its stuff, there's going to be a link in the chat And what I'm going to do is just give you a quick visual version of how it works. So we're going to go zoom into the Gulf here for this particular example. And we'll start with the Gulf sea turtles indicator. So darker values, darker colors, or higher values in this case. So here's the Gulf sea turtle, and we're going to go back and forth between the draft blueprint priorities and some of these individual indicators. So here we go, Gulf sea turtles. All right, we got to get some of this good stuff from Gulf sea turtles. And now if you look at the priorities, you can see, okay, I see how it's grabbing those important places for Gulf sea turtles in the priorities. All right, but there's a bunch of other things too, obviously at play. But we got some of the good stuff from Gulf sea turtles. What are we going to do next? Well, let's look at Gulf marine mammals. So remember that sort of like those cooler colors, the more dark blue colors are the highest value in this case. And now if we look, all right, yep, we're grabbing some of those important places for Gulf marine mammals as well in the process. Grab some of those. Next, here's Gulf deep sea coral. And so those darker colors of red, those are the higher values, higher genus richness. And as we go back and forth, you can see how we're grabbing some of those. Now we're grabbing some spots in the flower banks and other spots there. And now we'll look at one more. We'll look at Gulf hard bottom habitat. Now we're fairly zoomed out, but there's a lot more of the darkest high priority areas. These are more of the, particularly sort of the confirmed deep sea coral areas, chemosynthetic communities and organisms that get captured, but they're a little bit small. But as we go back and forth, you can see some of those are now coming out in the prioritization as well from the hard bottom habitat indicator. So there you go. There's your quick whirlwind of how zonation works and how we get from the indicators to the priorities themselves. And with that, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to move on to map review. But before we dive into looking at the map, I'm going to stop here and see if anyone has any questions.